Sergeant Emily Dawson was only 19 years old, her body still carrying the lean strength and rigid discipline of a soldier fresh out of basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, when her world turned upside down. She had barely stepped back into civilian streets hoping for a weekend of quiet rest with her mother, when she found herself stumbling across cracked pavement toward the glowing red and blue lights of the Atlanta Police Department Zone 2 precinct. Each breath burned her chest like fire. Each step sent pain radiating through her ribs, and her face was smeared with blood where Harold Carter, the man who claimed the right to call himself her stepfather, had struck her again and again. Officers on duty dropped their coffee cups when they saw the sight of a young woman in partial military uniform, battered and gasping, dragging herself through the glass doors. One officer rushed forward, shouting for a medic, while another grabbed his radio. Emily collapsed onto the cool, tiled floor, her voice thin and trembling. She whispered the words that made the entire room freeze. "My stepdad demanded $60,000 after just 3 days of raising me. Then he tried to end me." The silence that followed was heavier than any battlefield she had trained for. An officer bent low and pressed his ear close. Emily repeated, her lips cracked and trembling. "He wanted $60,000 as if I was his debt, and when I refused, he beat me until I thought I would never stand again." Within moments, paramedics wheeled in a stretcher. As they lifted her, Emily's vision blurred, and she thought of the absurdity of it all. She had survived the brutal weeks of drills at Fort Benning, the heat, the crawling through mud, the screaming sergeants, only to nearly lose her life in her own mother's home at the hands of a man she barely knew. The ambulance siren wailed as she was rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital, the largest trauma center in Atlanta, its name glowing through her fading consciousness. The world around her was slipping, but her mind replayed the cruel smile Harold had worn just days earlier when he sat at the head of the dinner table and slid an envelope across the polished wood. Inside was not a congratulatory note or a welcome home card. It was an invoice typed neatly with lines for food, lodging training supplements, medical checkups, and even something Harold had boldly listed as psychological support. At the bottom, circled in red ink, was the total $60,000. He had leaned back in his chair and said in a tone as smug as a drill sergeant, mocking a recruit 3 days under my roof, "And this is what it cost me. Now you are a soldier, Emily, so it is time you learn about responsibility. You pay back what you owe." She had stared at him in disbelief. Her mother Donna sat silently at the other end of the table, her eyes fixed on her plate. Emily had searched her mother's face for help, but found only fear, a woman too accustomed to Harold's control to protest. That was when Emily realized she was alone in this fight. She remembered her voice breaking as she asked, "You are charging me $60,000 for 3 days of staying here." Harold's eyes had glinted with something dark, and he replied, "Nothing in this world is free. Not food, not shelter, not the roof you are under. You soldiers live on taxpayer dollars. Do you think real life is any different?" That was the beginning of her nightmare. Now on the stretcher, strapped down by paramedics and surrounded by fluorescent hospital lights, Emily's heart thudded with both pain and rage. Her body bore the evidence of Harold's fists and the wooden chair he had hurled into her ribs, but her spirit refused to break. Each beat of her heart carried the same words her late father once drilled into her during childhood. "A Dawson never bows to bullies." Her father's voice felt so close she could almost hear it above the sirens. The memory collided with the brutal present, fueling the last ounce of strength she had to whisper to the nurse holding her IV. "Do not let him win." The nurse frowned, asking gently who should not win. Her eyelids fluttered and she whispered, "Harold Carter, my stepfather. He thinks he owns me. He thinks he can buy and sell my life." Then she passed out. Hours later, as she drifted in and out of morphine-soaked dreams, police officers stood in the hallway outside her hospital room, debating the absurdity of her claim. Who invoices their stepdaughter $60,000 for 3 days of care? But the bruises on her body, the deep purple swelling along her jaw, the cracked rib shown in her X-ray, told them this was not just a domestic quarrel. This was extortion twisted into violence, a case unlike anything they had seen. Emily woke to the steady beep of a heart monitor, her mouth dry, her body aching. She realized she was safe for the moment, but she also knew this was only the beginning. Harold was not the type of man to stop. He would pursue her, push his claims, and drag her into court if necessary. She thought of the envelope again, that ridiculous bill dressed as an invoice, and anger tightened her chest. She would not let Harold write the story of her life. She had her own uniform, her own honor, and the resilience of every mile she had run in basic. For the first time since leaving Fort Benning, Emily whispered to herself, "This is not just survival, this is war, and I will not lose." Emily Dawson's earliest memories were not of violence, but of warmth, small moments stitched together inside a modest two-bedroom apartment in Augusta, Georgia. Her father, Michael Dawson, had been a Marine who carried discipline in his posture but tenderness in his voice. She remembered the nights when he returned from duty, boots muddy, uniform stiff, yet he always scooped her up and called her soldier with a grin that erased every worry from her small heart. He died suddenly when Emily was just 8, a car accident on a rain-slick highway that turned her mother into a widow overnight and left Emily staring at a folded flag instead of her father's strong hands. The funeral blurred past her the crisp uniforms of Marines standing at attention, the sound of taps on a lonely bugle, and the weight of silence inside the apartment that followed. Her mother, Donna Dawson, tried to hold life together. She worked long hours at a local clinic, stretching every paycheck to keep food on the table. Their apartment was small, but filled with laughter during those years, because Donna believed that if she could keep Emily's spirit bright, then the loss of Michael would not swallow them whole. She pinned Emily's school certificates on the wall and celebrated every small achievement with cheap ice cream cones at the corner store. Emily's dream of following in her father's footsteps was born then out of loyalty and the stories her father told of service and honor. She promised herself that one day she too would wear the uniform, not out of pressure, but out of a fierce need to continue the Dawson line of duty. Yet as Emily grew, Donna grew weary. The bills piled up, and the loneliness of widowhood pressed on her shoulders. She met Harold Carter when Emily was 15. He was a real estate investor from Brookhaven, Atlanta, polished in appearance and confident in speech. He took Donna to restaurants she had never entered before and gifted Emily expensive notebooks for school things Donna could not afford. On the surface, Harold looked like salvation, the answer to a tired woman's prayers. But Emily felt unease even then. His compliments were laced with calculation. He always asked how much things cost and whether Emily's grades would be useful enough to make it worth it. He never touched her roughly in those years, but his words sliced like cold knives. When Donna married Harold 2 years later, Emily stood at the edge of the ceremony clutching a photo of her father and whispered to the picture that she was not replacing him, that no man could. They moved into Harold's large colonial house in Brookhaven with manicured lawns and neighbors who waved politely. At first, Emily thought maybe her instincts were wrong. Harold provided nice clothes for her mother and a larger room for her. Yet quickly the cracks appeared. Harold liked to show off his new family in public, calling them his perfect household, but in private, he controlled everything. Emily's allowance stopped, and instead, Harold demanded chores be completed to earn her keep. When she wanted to apply for an advanced summer program in science, Harold told her the money was wasted unless she planned to become a doctor and earn him recognition. Donna, once independent, became quiet, leaning on Harold's accounts for every expense. Emily saw her mother surrender little by little, choosing comfort and stability over confrontation. The girl who had once been showered with encouragement now lived under constant reminders of what she cost. At 16, when her peers received cars for birthdays, Harold handed Emily a bus schedule and said discipline meant walking. Her cousin Cassidy, Harold's daughter from a previous marriage who visited occasionally, flaunted designer handbags and boasted about private dance lessons, while Emily's requests for school field trip fees were met with lectures about responsibility. Still, Emily held her father's words in her chest, "A Dawson never bows to bullies." She focused on school, finding refuge in the JROTC program at her high school. There in uniform, she felt her father's presence again, standing straighter, marching with purpose. Her instructors noticed her dedication and told her she had the makings of a strong soldier. That validation was oxygen in a house that suffocated her. Donna watched with quiet pride, but never spoke against Harold. In private moments, Emily sometimes caught her mother's eyes glistening with guilt, but the words never came. One night, when Emily overheard Harold scolding Donna for spending too much on groceries, she saw her mother's shoulders sag in defeat, and she realized the woman who had once been her protector was now a prisoner of Harold's control. The toxic foundation was cemented, Harold demanding power, Donna yielding to keep the peace, and Emily learning that survival meant silence until she was strong enough to escape. Emily's resolve hardened as she approached graduation. She applied to the army, determined to follow through on the dream planted by her father. Harold scoffed, saying, "At least the army will finally pay for you instead of me." Donna forced a smile at the enlistment ceremony, but Emily caught the tremor in her mother's hands. When she left for basic training at Fort Benning, Emily promised herself she would never allow Harold's version of family to define her future. She would build her strength, her honor, and her independence. What she did not know was that the toxic bond she thought she left behind would snap tight the moment she returned, setting the stage for the invoice, the violence, and the courtroom battles that would nearly destroy her. The past was not just background, it was the soil in which Harold's cruelty had rooted itself. And Emily's story was about to show whether resilience planted by her father's love and sharpened by her own choices could withstand the storm of a stepfather who believed money and control could break a soldier's soul. The bus ride back from Fort Benning to Atlanta should have been a homecoming filled with relief, but for Emily Dawson, it felt more like marching into enemy territory. She was 19, a freshly minted soldier who had endured 12 grueling weeks of basic training. Her body hardened and her mind sharpened. She stepped off the bus in her pressed uniform duffel bag slung over one shoulder and inhaled the humid Georgia air with the hope that maybe her mother would smile and Harold would at least keep his temper in check. Donna was waiting at the curb outside the Brookhaven Colonial House, her face lighting with a smile that seemed both genuine and fragile. She hugged Emily tightly, whispering, "I missed you, baby," before quickly glancing toward the doorway where Harold stood. He wore a crisp shirt and the smirk of a man who wanted to project power even on his own front porch. "Welcome home, soldier," he said, his tone playful but edged with condescension. Emily saluted him sarcastically, her eyes narrowing, already sensing the tension beneath his words. That evening, Harold insisted on a family dinner. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier plates arranged like they were hosting dignitaries. Emily noticed her mother's nervous hands as she placed serving bowls of roast chicken and vegetables as if any wrong move could spark Harold's disapproval. At first, the conversation was stiff but civil. Harold asked Emily about the drills, the marches, the discipline. She answered politely, though she knew he cared less about her answers and more about his chance to critique. As dessert was cleared away, Harold leaned back in his chair, clasped his hands together, and with a deliberate motion slid a thick envelope across the table toward Emily. "Here," he said. "A welcome home gift." Suspicion prickled at the back of her neck. Emily opened the envelope expecting perhaps a note or some hollow gesture. Instead, her eyes fell on typed sheets, each line neatly itemized: room and board, $900. Food expenses, $2,000. Training supplements, $3,000. Insurance coverage, $4,000. Miscellaneous psychological support, $1,000. Medical checkups, $1,500. The list went on until her vision blurred, the total at the bottom circled in bold red ink. $60,000. For a moment, Emily thought it was a sick joke. Her chest tightened as she looked up to see Harold watching her with smug satisfaction. "You are officially a soldier now," he said. "Time you learn what things really cost. Nothing in this world is free. Not food, not housing, not even the seat you are sitting on." Emily's voice cracked as she asked, "You are charging me $60,000 for 3 days of staying here." Harold chuckled, tapping the invoice with one finger. 3 days and 19 years, Emily. I have kept a roof over your head every time your mother could not, and I have paid for things you never even noticed. You think discipline is free. You think all those nights of me paying bills came without a cost." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Now you are an adult, and adults pay their debts." Across the table, Donna sat frozen, her fork untouched, her lips pressed tightly together. Emily searched her mother's face for outrage, for denial, for anything, but found only the flicker of guilt and fear. "Say something." Emily urged silently, but Donna lowered her eyes. Emily pushed the envelope back across the table, her jaw set. "I do not owe you anything," she said firmly. "My father died serving this country, and any support my mother received was for me, not for you." Harold's smirk hardened into a glare. He leaned back slowly, his voice measured. "Watch your tone, soldier. You are under my roof, and you will respect my authority." "Authority," Emily spat, "or extortion." Harold's hand slammed the table so hard the glasses rattled. Donna flinched, whispering, "Please, Emily, do not fight him," but the damage was done. Harold's face flushed red, and he leaned forward, his voice sharp. "You think the army will protect you, but you are nothing without me. I can make one phone call and ruin that shiny career of yours. I know people who can bury your record before you even begin." Emily's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. She knew Harold thrived on fear, and if she backed down now, it would only grow worse. Still, she could feel the isolation like a noose around her neck. Her own mother sat silent, unwilling or unable to intervene. In that moment, Emily understood the full depth of Harold's control. The invoice was not about money. It was about dominance, about proving that no matter what uniform she wore, he could still crush her. She stood abruptly, pushing her chair back. "I will not sign this," she said. "Not now, not ever." Harold rose too, his frame towering over her. His voice dropped to a chilling calm. "Then you will learn the hard way what defiance costs in this house." Emily glanced once more at Donna, who whispered through trembling lips, "Please, Emily, just survive." That whisper carried the weight of years of silence of nights when Donna had chosen submission over confrontation. Emily clenched her fists at her sides, her heart aching not only with anger, but with disappointment. She had dreamed of this homecoming being a reunion, but it had turned into a battlefield. That night, she lay awake in her old room, the envelope burning in her mind. She stared at the faded blue ceiling, her father's words echoing a Dawson never bows to bullies. She could hear Harold's footsteps pacing in the hallway outside the predator circling, waiting for her next move. She knew the invoice was only the beginning, a declaration of war. What she did not yet know was how quickly Harold would escalate from financial control to raw violence, and how the walls of that Brookhaven house would become her prison, her mother's silence, her chains, and her own resilience the only weapon she had left. The invoice had been the spark, but the explosion came quickly after. On the second night back in Brookhaven, Emily refused again to acknowledge Harold's so-called debt. He cornered her in the kitchen where the light above the stove cast long shadows across the tiled floor. Donna was washing dishes with nervous hands, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for an impact she had endured before. Harold's voice rumbled low at first, asking whether she had reconsidered his demand. When Emily said no, he struck without hesitation. His palm cracked across her face, sending her stumbling into the counter. Donna gasped, her hand rising to her mouth, but no protest left her lips. Harold advanced, his chest swelling with the satisfaction of control. "You think you are tougher now that you wear that uniform," he sneered, "but here you are under my roof." Emily straightened, blood already seeping from a cut at the corner of her mouth. She held his stare, her voice shaking but firm. "I will never pay you, Harold. You are nothing but a coward." The insult lit fire in his eyes. He grabbed the nearest chair and swung it into her side. The wood slammed against her ribs and she crumpled to the floor, gasping. Donna cried out, rushing forward, but Harold barked her name so sharply that she froze mid-step. "Do not interfere," he ordered. "This is between me and her." The sounds of struggle carried beyond the walls. In the house next door, 60-year-old Evelyn Parker paused in her knitting chair, listening as muffled shouts turned into a scream. Evelyn had lived in the neighborhood for decades and had seen the Carters as an odd family. Harold always too polished in public, Donna too quiet. Tonight, the noise was different. She stood heart-racing and moved to her back porch. Through the hedges, she glimpsed movement at the Dawson Carter house. She saw a figure slam against a window, then fall out of sight. Evelyn hurried inside and dialed 911. "I think there is a violent fight happening next door," she told the dispatcher. "My neighbor's stepdaughter is in danger." Inside, Emily clawed her way upright. Harold's shadow loomed larger with each step. Donna whispered desperately, "Please, Harold, she is just a girl." But Harold shoved her back against the sink. Emily's training kicked in. Her ribs screamed in pain, but she scanned the room for escape. The kitchen window was cracked open. She lunged for it, shoving it wider and pulling herself through. Her body half hung outside when Harold yanked her ankle, dragging her back across the sill. Splinters tore at her skin as she kicked wildly. One foot connected with his chest, and he stumbled long enough for her to slip free and drop onto the lawn. She crawled toward the fence, gasping, her vision blurring. Evelyn, now outside her own porch, called again into her phone. "She is trying to escape. I can see her crawling. Please hurry." Harold stormed after Emily, grabbing her by the arm before she could reach the gate. He hauled her up and slammed her against the wooden boards, snarling, "You will not embarrass me in front of this neighborhood. You will learn your place." He struck her again, fists landing with the precision of someone who wanted to break not only bones, but spirit. Donna appeared in the doorway, sobbing, her voice shaking. "Stop, Harold, please, stop." He turned his head briefly, his grip on Emily loosening. In that fleeting moment, Emily wrenched free, staggering toward the side yard. She crashed through bushes, her uniform tearing every breath, a knife in her chest. Evelyn's porch light illuminated her face for just an instant. Blood streaked down her cheek, her eyes wide with determination. Evelyn shouted, "Run, honey! Keep going!" That voice, the first sound of support Emily had heard all night, propelled her forward. She reached the street and half ran, half stumbled down the sidewalk. Behind her, she heard Harold curse loudly and the slam of a door. Donna's cries echoed faintly before fading into silence. Emily pressed on her lungs, heaving ribs stabbing with each step. She knew the precinct was only a few blocks away. Each crack in the pavement threatened to trip her, but she willed herself to move, repeating under her breath like a soldier's chant. Just one more step, just one more block. The neon glow of the police station appeared like a lighthouse through the haze. She collapsed into the lobby, the officers rushing toward her, and the world tilted into black. Later, when paramedics wheeled her into Grady Memorial Hospital, detectives already on scene took Evelyn's statement. She described everything she saw, her voice steady with outrage. "I heard the fighting. I saw her crawl out that window. I saw him pull her back. That man is dangerous." Donna gave no statement that night. She remained in the house, paralyzed between loyalty and fear, her silence as loud as Evelyn's testimony. For Emily, the events of that night would mark the turning point. No longer could she believe Harold's control was confined to financial games. He had crossed the line fully into violence, and she had nearly lost her life. The bruises across her ribs and the swelling on her face would fade in time, but the betrayal of her mother's silence and the memory of Harold's invoice burned deeper than any wound. In the days that followed, she would wake in the hospital bed, pain anchoring her to the present, but her mind always replayed the kitchen, the chair smashing against her body, the desperate crawl into the night, and Evelyn's voice urging her to run. It was then that Emily resolved she would not simply endure Harold. She would fight him with evidence, with allies, and with every ounce of the discipline she had earned at Fort Benning. The invoice had been his attempt to write her story as one of debt. She would rewrite it as a story of justice. Lying in the hospital bed with her ribs bandaged and her cheeks swollen, Emily Dawson drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind torn between the pain of the present and the echoes of her past. Whenever she closed her eyes, she saw her father, Michael Dawson, the Marine, who had once been the anchor of her world. He had been tall and steady, his voice carrying the calm confidence of a man who believed in service above self. In her earliest memories, he crouched beside her in the small yard of their Augusta apartment, showing her how to hold a plastic toy rifle with both hands, her tiny arms trembling with effort. He never encouraged aggression, only discipline. A Dawson never bows to bullies, he had said, his finger lifting her chin so her eyes met his. That sentence became the creed of her childhood, the unshakable line of defense whenever she felt small. The loss of Michael had carved a hole in her life, but his teachings lingered in the corners of her memory like a constant drill sergeant reminding her of who she was supposed to be. She remembered evenings when he returned from duty weary but smiling, carrying her on his shoulders as he told her about the importance of courage. When she asked him if soldiers ever got scared, he admitted yes, but courage was doing your duty even when you were scared. That honesty had rooted deep inside her. Now, in the sterile brightness of Grady Memorial Hospital, she repeated his words under her breath as if they could steady her pulse. Courage is doing your duty, even when you are scared. She needed that truth more than ever. She thought back to the summers before his death, the trips to the park, where he timed her sprints across the grass clapping as she ran faster than the boys her age. He told her she had a runner's heart steady and determined. At night, he tucked her into bed and promised that no matter what happened in life, the Dawson name meant resilience. When the accident stole him from her at 8 years old, Emily had promised silently at his grave that she would live out that legacy. The folded flag that the Marines handed her mother still lay in a case on Emily's dresser years later, a symbol she looked at whenever she doubted herself. That promise had carried her through the suffocating years with Harold Carter. Whenever he lectured her about cost or belittled her dreams, she whispered her father's creed in her mind, never bow to bullies. It became her invisible shield. In high school, when Harold scoffed at her joining JROTC, saying it was a waste of time, Emily pressed her uniform neatly each morning and wore it with pride, imagining her father watching from somewhere above. She remembered the weight of the wooden drill rifle, heavier than her toy, and how her arms ached during long parades. She never quit because quitting felt like betraying him. The instructors noticed, calling her Dawson the Determined, a name that made her heart swell. Now, recalling those moments, she realized that all of it had been preparing her for this fight with Harold. The battlefield was not foreign soil, but her own home. The enemy not another nation, but the man who claimed to be her stepfather. Yet the principles were the same: discipline, resilience, courage. As the morphine haze ebbed and flowed, Emily imagined her father beside her hospital bed. In her mind's eye, he sat in his uniform, leaning forward, eyes steady, saying, "You are a soldier now, Emily. You have the training. You can outlast him." She swallowed hard tears, sliding down her cheeks because she needed that voice so badly. Her mother's silence had left her unmoored, but her father's memory was a compass pointing true north. Even in death, he was still her protector. When the nurses changed her bandages, Emily bit down on her lip rather than cry out, remembering how her father had taught her to hold still during vaccinations when she was little. "Pain is temporary," he said then. "Discipline is forever." In the quiet hours of the night, she heard the distant sound of military cadence from her memory, the call and response of soldiers running at dawn. Left, right, left, right. The rhythm lulled her, reminding her that she belonged to something larger than Harold's house, larger than his power. She belonged to the lineage of her father, to the discipline of the army, to the unbreakable belief that no tyrant could truly own her. The memory of his funeral returned unbidden, the sight of Marines folding the flag, the sound of taps echoing across the cemetery. At 8, she had not understood everything, only that her father was gone. Now, at 19, she finally grasped the weight of sacrifice, the way one life could anchor another long after it ended. She understood that his death was not the end of his influence. It was the foundation of her strength. Harold thought he could invoice her, beat her, and claim ownership, but Harold had underestimated the one thing: he could never touch the legacy her father left inside her bones. As dawn crept through the blinds of her hospital window, Emily stared at the pale light and whispered, "I will not let you down, Dad. I will not bow." That vow steadied her. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about honoring Michael Dawson's name. Her father had died in uniform, and she now lived in one. She carried his spirit into every breath, and that made her stronger than Harold could ever understand. Her body ached with each movement, but her spirit rose higher with each memory of her father's lessons. She was no longer just a wounded stepdaughter. She was a soldier preparing for a different kind of war, one fought not with rifles and drills, but with truth, evidence, and resilience. And as she clenched her fists lightly against the bed sheets, Emily knew she was ready to fight. While Emily healed in Grady Memorial Hospital, detectives began peeling away the polished exterior Harold Carter had built so carefully for his neighbors and colleagues. In Brookhaven, he appeared as the successful real estate investor, the man with the perfectly mowed lawn and the gleaming car parked in his driveway. He shook hands at church on Sundays, spoke about community investments, at neighborhood meetings, and always seemed to have the right words for those who admired his confidence. But beneath that mask, the truth was darker, and Emily had already glimpsed pieces of it. Now, with the police involved, the fragments came together. Records surfaced that Harold had been accused of domestic violence years earlier in Savannah, Georgia. Back then, charges never stuck because of his ability to pay top attorneys and intimidate victims into silence. He had walked away untarnished, his reputation preserved his power intact. To most, he was untouchable. For Emily, lying in her hospital bed with bruises still raw, the knowledge confirmed what she had always suspected: Harold was not new to this game. He thrived on control money and fear, and he had been playing it long before she returned home. The invoice for $60,000 was not just about financial greed. It was his way of cementing dominance, of reminding her that even as a soldier, she remained his captive in spirit. But Harold had underestimated her resolve and the strength of the allies she was beginning to gather. One afternoon, Donna visited Emily at the hospital. She sat in the chair by the bed, her hands twisting a tissue until it shredded. Emily turned her face to the window, unwilling to offer comfort. Finally, Donna spoke, her voice low and trembling. "I never wanted it to come to this. He told me he would keep us safe, that after your father died, we needed someone steady." Emily turned, her eyes flashing. "Safe, Mom. Is this what safe looks like? Bruises on your daughter, hospital bills, neighbors calling the police." Donna flinched, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You do not understand," she whispered. "Without him, we would have lost everything. The house, the stability. I thought I was protecting you." Emily's heart wavered for a moment at the sight of her mother's pain. She saw not only weakness, but also the chains of fear Harold had wrapped around Donna. Her mother's silence had not been born of cruelty alone, but of dependence, the desperate clinging to a man who had promised security. Still, Emily's anger burned. Protecting me would have been standing up for me. Instead, you stood by him. Donna buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Emily turned away, her jaw tight. She could not let her mother's guilt cloud the truth Harold had stolen, not only peace, but also the money that should have secured Emily's future. The breakthrough came when Emily convinced Donna during one of those hospital visits to bring her Harold's briefcase from his home office. Donna, torn between loyalty and shame, finally agreed. Inside, Emily found documents that made her blood run cold. Bank statements, insurance paperwork, and legal notices revealed that after her father Michael's death, Harold had taken control of a $250,000 life insurance policy meant for Emily's care. Rather than safeguarding it, he had siphoned it into personal accounts, using it to expand his real estate ventures and fund the lifestyle he flaunted in Brookhaven. Each page Emily read deepened her fury. That money had been her father's final provision, his way of ensuring his daughter's future. Harold had turned it into leverage, twisting it into a weapon to remind Emily she owed him. When she showed the papers to the detectives, their faces tightened. "This is more than domestic violence," one officer said grimly. "This is financial fraud." Emily photographed every document, storing copies in her email, determined not to let Harold bury the evidence. The truth behind his mask was no longer just rumor. It was documented, undeniable. That evening, alone in her hospital bed, Emily reflected on what she had uncovered. Harold had built his reputation on lies, feeding off her mother's fear and the neighborhood's admiration. He had manipulated Donna into submission stolen from Emily's inheritance, and now tried to dress it all up as a legitimate invoice. But masks always crack under pressure, and his was beginning to shatter. Meanwhile, Donna wrestled with her own demons. She spent sleepless nights in the empty Brookhaven bedroom, staring at the closet where Harold's suits hung in perfect rows. She thought back to the years after Michael's death, how Harold had walked into her life, promising relief from the constant struggle. She had been vulnerable, desperate, and Harold had seemed like a savior. Yet each compromise, each moment of silence had chained her tighter. Watching her daughter in the hospital broke something in her. She realized her silence had been complicity, that love for Harold had warped into fear, and fear had silenced her maternal instinct. In the dark hours, Donna whispered apologies to the empty room, though she knew Emily might never hear them. Harold, meanwhile, moved quickly. He filed legal paperwork against Emily, seeking to legitimize his $60,000 claim in Fulton County Court. He boasted to acquaintances that his ungrateful stepdaughter would finally pay what she owed. He told Donna that Emily was nothing without him, that the Army could not save her from debts. But cracks showed in his confidence. Evelyn Parker, the neighbor, had already given her statement. Police had questions about the insurance documents. The mask Harold wore in Brookhaven's manicured streets was beginning to slip, and for the first time in years, Donna saw the man she had married for what he was: not a provider, not a savior, but a predator. For Emily, the revelation brought clarity. Harold's violence had nearly killed her, but his greed and arrogance would undo him in court. She resolved that if Harold wanted a battle, she would give him one. With the truth in hand, with her father's creed burning in her chest, and with allies ready to stand beside her, she would drag Harold into the light where his mask could no longer hide him. Emily Dawson had survived the storm of Harold's fists, uncovered the theft of her father's insurance, and endured her mother's silence, but now she faced a different kind of war. This one would not be won with brute strength or raw endurance. It would demand intelligence, patience, and the kind of strategic thinking she had begun learning as a soldier. Still recovering at Grady Memorial Hospital, she received a visit from Lieutenant Rachel Morales, a sharp-eyed officer in the military police who had heard about Emily's situation through a chain of command inquiry. Morales pulled a chair to Emily's bedside and leaned forward, speaking with the clipped confidence of someone used to leading under pressure. "Document everything, soldier. Photos of injuries, medical bills, every scrap of paper that ties him to those insurance funds. Do not just survive this, prove it." Emily nodded, grateful for guidance that felt firm and familiar. She had been trained to gather intel in hostile terrain. Now the hostile terrain was her own family home. Morales became more than an advisor. She became a mentor, reminding Emily that strength was not just physical, but also procedural. Through her, Emily learned what evidence courts respected and how to preserve it. Morales's presence lit a fire under her determination. Soon another ally entered the fight. Attorney Marcus Wright, recommended by a detective who knew his reputation in family law, visited Emily with a folder already half full of notes. He was tall, serious, and spoke with measured precision. After reviewing Harold's invoice and the insurance documents Emily had retrieved, he shook his head. "This is not just a family dispute, Emily. This is misappropriation of funds and abuse. We can counter his claim and expose him." He outlined a strategy file. A counterclaim: demand Harold's financial records through discovery and use the evidence of violence and fraud to not only dismiss Harold's case, but also turn the tide against him. Emily felt steadier hearing the plan spoken aloud. She was no longer a cornered girl. She was a soldier with a mission. Then came her comrade from basic training, Private First Class Daniel Lee. Daniel had been her battle buddy through long marches and obstacle courses, the kind of friend who could joke about mud on their boots even after 20 miles of running. When he heard about her ordeal, he visited the hospital carrying not only flowers, but also a flash drive. "I know tech," he said simply. "Let me help you pull copies of any files he has, any emails, anything. Harold might think he controls the narrative, but we can outflank him." With Daniel's help, Emily secured backups of documents from Harold's laptop and home office copies that Marcus would later present in court. It felt like an operation, and Emily's training clicked into place: gather intel, secure allies, execute the plan. The final unexpected ally came from just across the hedge, Mrs. Evelyn Parker. The neighbor who had heard the screams and seen Emily crawl into the yard stepped into the role of witness without hesitation. When Marcus visited her to collect testimony, Evelyn folded her arms firmly. "I am not afraid of that man. I will tell the judge what I saw and heard." Emily nearly cried when she heard those words. For so long she had felt abandoned even by her mother, but Evelyn's willingness to stand tall reminded her that justice often required ordinary courage from ordinary people. Piece by piece, Emily built her resistance. She kept a journal documenting each conversation, each bruise, each medical report. Daniel helped her scan documents and lock them in encrypted files. Morales checked in regularly, offering tactical advice. Marcus prepared her for courtroom testimony, walking her through difficult questions Harold's lawyer might ask. Each ally played a part, like members of a squad moving in sync. For the first time since stepping back into Brookhaven, Emily felt she was not alone. Yet she also knew the risks. Harold was still out there boasting to neighbors that Emily was ungrateful and that he would teach her a lesson in court. He strutted in public, his mask barely intact, but his threats simmered beneath the surface. Donna remained caught in the middle, visiting Emily quietly but still unable to sever herself from Harold completely. Emily wrestled with the ache of betrayal, but she pressed forward. She had no time to wait for her mother to choose. Each night, staring at the hospital ceiling or later the temporary apartment Marcus helped arrange for her, Emily repeated her father's words. Never bow to bullies. With every photo she cataloged, every page of documents she scanned, she felt herself rising from victim to fighter. Her ribs still ached, her face bore fading bruises, but her spirit hardened. She remembered the cadence of basic training runs the call and response echoing through Georgia pines. She imagined her allies running beside her Morales, shouting cadence, Daniel cracking jokes, Evelyn holding a flag, Marcus charting the route. Together they were marching toward justice. When Marcus filed the official counterclaim, Harold's mask cracked a little more. The man who had thought an invoice would break Emily now faced a legal battle that threatened to expose everything he had stolen. Emily stood outside the courthouse on the day of the filing, the papers heavy in her hand. She looked up at the American flag flapping above the building and whispered to her father, "This is for you, Dad. I am not just surviving. I am fighting back." The war was no longer one-sided. Harold had his money and his arrogance, but Emily had evidence allies and the determination of a soldier who refused to bow. The day Harold Carter dragged his stepdaughter into Fulton County Court, the air outside the courthouse was heavy with August heat, the kind that stuck to skin and made tempers short. Emily Dawson arrived in her pressed uniform, her medals still modest, but gleaming enough to remind everyone that she was not just another young woman caught in a family feud. She was a soldier, and she carried herself with the posture of one. Walking beside her was attorney Marcus Wright, his briefcase stuffed with the documents and evidence that would soon tear through Harold's polished facade. Behind them trailed Evelyn Parker, steady and calm, her voice ready to echo the screams she had heard that night. Donna walked separately, pale and trembling, torn between loyalty and shame, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. The courtroom was smaller than Emily expected, wood panels and worn benches, but the stakes felt larger than life. When Harold entered, his confidence filled the space. He wore a crisp suit, his hair slicked back, his smile practiced. He waved to acquaintances as though attending a business luncheon rather than a case of alleged abuse and fraud. At his side was his attorney, Daniel Brooks, a smooth talker with an expensive watch. They sat at the plaintiff's table, Harold leaning back with the air of a man who believed the outcome already written. Judge Harriet Woodson, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, took the bench with authority that silenced the room. The clerk read the case, Harold Carter vs. Emily Dawson claim of $60,000 for expenses incurred. Emily's jaw tightened at the words, but she stood straighter, gripping the small notebook where she had written her father's creed. The trial began with Harold's attorney presenting the claim. Brooks painted Harold as a selfless man who had opened his home to his orphaned stepdaughter after her father's tragic death, who had provided food, lodging, medical coverage, and support without complaint. He displayed the invoice like it was a reasonable account, his voice dripping with condescension. Now that she is an adult and gainfully employed in the United States Army, my client asks only for reimbursement of the extraordinary costs he bore on her behalf. Harold nodded solemnly, as if enduring a burden nobly. Some in the gallery murmured, impressed by the show. Emily clenched her fists, her ribs aching with each breath, but she forced her gaze steady. When it was Marcus's turn, he rose slowly, placing his hands on the counsel table. "This is not about repayment of expenses, Your Honor. This is about a man who has stolen from his stepdaughter, abused his power, and attempted to disguise theft as generosity." He requested to submit evidence, and with the judge's nod, he began. One by one, Marcus laid out documents, bank statements showing monthly deposits of survivor benefits, records of the life insurance policy worth $250,000 inheritance funds from Emily's grandparents. The pile grew taller, and with each page, Harold's confident smirk wavered. Marcus spoke clearly, every word carrying weight. This young woman's father provided for her even in death. Those funds were intended for her care. Instead, Mr. Carter commingled them with his own accounts, spent them on real estate ventures, and then had the audacity to claim she owes him more. The judge's eyes narrowed her pen, scratching notes furiously. Then Evelyn Parker was called. She walked to the stand with her back straight, a grandmotherly figure in simple clothes, but her voice rang with conviction. I heard shouting. I heard Emily cry out. I saw her crawl through the window, and I saw him drag her back. The courtroom held its breath. Harold's attorney tried to shake her testimony, suggesting perhaps she misheard, but Evelyn did not waver. I know what I saw. That man is dangerous. Donna was next. Called reluctantly, she walked to the stand, clutching tissues. Her voice cracked as she admitted she had stayed silent. I was afraid, she whispered, staring at her hands. I thought if I kept peace, we would survive. I never protected her the way I should have. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at the sight of a mother's broken confession. Harold fumed, whispering urgently to his attorney, but the damage was done. Finally, Emily took the stand. She sat upright, her voice calm but charged with emotion. She described the night Harold had struck her, the chair smashing into her ribs, the desperate crawl to the police station. She told the court about the envelope with its cruel invoice, the threat to ruin her Army career, and the discovery of stolen funds. She did not embellish. She let the facts speak. But when Brooks pressed her on cross-examination, asking whether she was simply ungrateful to a man who had raised her, she fixed him with a stare that silenced even the gallery. Raised me? She repeated. He stole from me. He tried to break me. A father raises a child. A predator exploits one. Her words cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. Judge Woodson held up a hand to stop further questions. She leaned forward, her eyes piercing Harold. I want to know about the $250,000. Where did it go? Harold stammered, claiming business expenses, family costs, medical care. Marcus interjected with receipts and statements that disproved every claim. With each document, Harold's mask dissolved. The once polished man now shifted uncomfortably, his collar damp with sweat. The gallery whispered the air, thick with realization that this was not a case of repayment, but of greed exposed. The judge called for a brief recess, but the tone had already shifted. Emily sat down beside Marcus, her hands trembling with adrenaline. But when Evelyn reached over and squeezed her arm, she felt steady again. The battle was not finished, but the tide had turned. The courtroom returned from recess to a silence so heavy it felt like even the wooden walls were waiting for judgment. Harold Carter adjusted his tie, his earlier bravado fraying at the edges. Donna sat with a crumpled tissue in her hands, her eyes swollen from tears, while Emily Dawson kept her posture upright, the faint shine of her Army uniform reminding everyone that she was not here as a timid girl, but as a soldier standing for her own dignity. Judge Harriet Woodson settled back onto the bench, her gaze sweeping across the room with authority. She spoke slowly, deliberately, as though weighing each word with the gravity of decades on the bench. I have reviewed the evidence presented and heard the testimonies. This case began with the claim by Mr. Carter that his stepdaughter owed him $60,000 for expenses supposedly incurred while raising her. She paused, her eyes locking on Harold, who tried to smile as though the judge might still lean in his favor. However, the financial records show a very different story. Over the course of several years, Mr. Carter received significant funds designated specifically for Ms. Dawson's benefit. She flipped through the folder before her lifting pages as she spoke. Social Security survivor benefits monthly deposits of more than $1,000, a life insurance payout of $250,000 following the death of her father, an inheritance from her grandparents. In total, nearly $300,000 was available for the care and future of Ms. Dawson, yet the evidence shows that very little, if any, was used directly for her needs. Emily's breath caught. Hearing the numbers out loud made the theft even heavier. The judge's tone sharpened. Instead, the funds were diverted into personal accounts, into real estate ventures, and into expenses that had nothing to do with the welfare of this child. At the same time, Ms. Dawson was denied basic necessities, forced to wear second-hand clothes, and even made to pay so-called rent from her part-time job earnings. The very audacity of this claim to demand further repayment after misusing funds is appalling. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Harold's attorney attempted to interject, "Your Honor," These were household costs, shared benefits, but Judge Woodson raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "I am not finished." She turned her gaze directly on Harold, her voice cutting. "You did not merely fail in your duty as guardian. You abused it. You treated a child's inheritance and survivor benefits as your own wallet. You treated her like a burden when in truth the law entrusted you with protection. And now you stand here demanding she owes you money." Harold's face reddened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Donna sobbed openly, whispering through tears, "I should have stopped it. I should have protected her." Emily's throat tightened at her mother's broken confession, but she kept her eyes on the judge, waiting for the verdict that would define this battle. Judge Woodson continued, her voice echoing with authority. "The claim for $60,000 is dismissed with prejudice. This court not only refuses your demand, Mr. Carter, but also refers this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential fraud, financial abuse, and domestic violence." The words landed like a gavel long before she struck hers. The courtroom erupted into whispers and gasps. Harold slammed a fist against the table, his attorney grabbing his arm to restrain him, but his mask had shattered completely. He no longer looked like the polished businessman of Brookhaven. He looked like a desperate man cornered by truth. Judge Woodson turned her attention to Emily, her voice softening slightly. "Ms. Dawson, you have the right to pursue civil recovery of the funds misused on your behalf. My clerk will provide you with the information. Whether you choose to do so is your decision." Emily nodded, her throat-tight gratitude welling behind her eyes. The judge's gaze returned to the gallery. "Let this case be a reminder. Guardianship is not ownership. Children are not debts to be collected. Funds entrusted for their care are sacred obligations, not opportunities for personal gain." She lifted the gavel and brought it down firmly. "Court is adjourned." The sound cracked through the air, final and irrevocable. Harold's body slumped, his attorney whispering frantically, but the damage was irreversible. Officers approached to escort him out as the referral to the district attorney meant his freedom was no longer assured. Donna collapsed into a bench, covering her face with her hands. Evelyn Parker stepped forward, placing a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "You did it, dear," she whispered, pride in her voice. Emily exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks, her ribs aching but her spirit lighter. She looked around the courtroom at the faces of strangers who now understood her truth, at the mother who could not meet her eyes, at the stepfather whose empire of control had finally cracked. For a moment, she thought of her father, Michael Dawson, and the folded flag on her dresser. She imagined him standing tall, saluting her for holding the line against a bully who thought he could break her. As she left the courtroom, sunlight spilling onto the courthouse steps, Emily realized that justice was not just a word. It was a weapon, and today it had been wielded on her behalf. The days that followed the courtroom verdict moved swiftly, as though justice once set in motion could not be slowed. Harold Carter was arrested the same afternoon on charges of fraud and domestic violence. The referral from Judge Woodson had given the district attorney's office more than enough cause to act, and when officers led Harold out of Fulton County Court in handcuffs, the man who once strutted through Brookhaven like an untouchable king suddenly looked small, his polished mask shattered. News of his arrest traveled quickly. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a case of financial exploitation and abuse within a blended family. Neighbors who had once waved politely at Harold from manicured lawns now shook their heads with disgust, whispering about how they had suspected something but never knew the extent. For Emily, the headlines felt surreal. She was not seeking fame, only freedom, yet seeing Harold's crimes exposed publicly was a vindication she had longed for since childhood. Donna Carter, stripped of Harold's protection, was forced to leave the Brookhaven house. The mortgage and debts Harold had hidden from her surfaced, and the once proud colonial home was seized as part of asset recovery. Donna moved in with her sister in Athens, Georgia, carrying little more than a suitcase and the hollow weight of her mistakes. Emily visited her once, not out of reconciliation, but out of duty, to hear the words her mother needed to say. Donna sat across from her at a diner, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, gone cold. "I was weak," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was protecting us by staying with him, but all I did was let him destroy us." Emily listened, her heart torn between pity and anger. "You chose him over me," she said quietly. Donna's tears fell, but Emily did not reach to wipe them. She left the diner with the knowledge that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be years away. Meanwhile, the Army took notice of Emily's resilience. Her commanders at Fort Benning praised her for embodying the discipline and courage drilled into every soldier. They commended her ability to remain steady under pressure, not in combat overseas, but in the battlefield of her own home. In a quiet ceremony, her unit recognized her with a commendation for courage in the face of domestic adversity, a gesture that reminded Emily she was not alone, that her service was seen and valued. Financially, Emily finally reclaimed some stability. The court ordered restitution from Harold's assets, restoring a portion of the insurance money that had been stolen from her. For the first time since her father's death, she had access to the security he had intended for her. Emily placed part of the money into a savings account, determined to use it wisely, and another part she donated quietly to a local shelter for survivors of domestic abuse, honoring her father's legacy of service. Harold's legal consequences deepened. Investigators uncovered patterns of fraudulent transfers, and other women from his past came forward with stories of intimidation and financial manipulation. He faced not only fraud charges but also counts of aggravated assault. His trial loomed larger with the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. Emily chose not to attend every hearing. She had seen enough of him in one courtroom. She focused instead on her recovery, her training, and her future. Yet she could not deny the satisfaction that came each time she heard another charge read aloud against him. The man who had tried to reduce her to a debt was now drowning in debts of his own to the law. Donna's consequences were quieter but no less painful. She lived in her sister's small house, cut off from the social circles she once tried to impress. Friends from church avoided her, unwilling to defend her choices. She began counseling, grappling with the realization that fear had turned her into an accomplice. For Emily, her mother's journey was no longer her responsibility. The burden of Donna's silence was Donna's to carry. Evelyn Parker, the neighbor whose courage had given Emily a voice, became something more than a witness. She invited Emily over for dinners, shared advice, and filled the gap of maternal warmth that had been absent for years. Evelyn's home smelled of pot roast and carried the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen hardship and endured. Emily found solace there, realizing that family was not always blood, but the people who stepped up when others turned away. Justice also meant facing the community that had once admired Harold. Emily spoke at a local town meeting, her uniform crisp, her voice unwavering as she described the importance of recognizing abuse hidden behind polished doors. Some neighbors lowered their eyes, ashamed they had ignored the warning signs. Others applauded her bravery. The ripple of her story extended beyond Brookhaven, reminding people that silence was complicity and that courage could spark change. The greatest consequence, however, was personal. Emily carried scars on her body and in her heart, but instead of letting them chain her, she turned them into armor. Each bruise had faded, but the memory of crawling out that window, of Evelyn's voice urging her to run, of Judge Woodson's gavel striking down Harold's claims, all of it became part of her strength. She learned that justice was not just about punishment. It was about reclaiming dignity, breaking cycles, and setting boundaries. Harold lost his freedom. Donna lost her illusions, and Emily gained her voice. Standing once more on the parade field at Fort Benning, Emily felt the Georgia sun warm her shoulders. She heard the cadence of her fellow soldiers running, and for the first time since her return from basic training, she felt fully in step with them. The consequences had been real, the justice undeniable, but the victory was not only in Harold's downfall. It was in her survival, her courage, and her refusal to bow to a bully. She had proven her father right. A Dawson never bows. After the storm of courtrooms and police investigations, Emily Dawson returned to Columbus, Georgia, not far from Fort Benning. The city carried the rhythm of soldiers and families, the constant hum of training flights overhead, and the kind of resilience only military towns seem to have. For Emily, it was the right place to begin again. She moved into a modest apartment with plain walls and second-hand furniture, but every corner carried her sense of independence. No invoices, no threats, no footsteps in the hallway that made her flinch. Just her own space, her own breath, her own future. Healing was not instant. Nightmares lingered. Sometimes she woke drenched in sweat, hearing Harold's voice demanding $60,000, or feeling the phantom ache of a chair smashing into her ribs. Other nights, she dreamed of her father, Michael Dawson, saluting her from across a field, his voice steady, never bow to bullies. Those dreams steadied her when the shadows felt too heavy. She began therapy with Dr. Lynn, a counselor specializing in family trauma. In those sessions, she admitted what she had never said aloud, that part of her still longed for her mother's love, even while resenting her silence. Dr. Lynn told her gently that grief and anger often walked side by side, and that it was possible to feel both without betraying herself. Emily carried that wisdom like a new kind of marching cadence. Her chosen family became her anchor. Lieutenant Rachel Morales checked in weekly, sometimes over coffee, sometimes with brisk phone calls reminding Emily to keep her documentation safe and her resolve sharper. Morales became a mentor who understood both the military structure and the chaos of family betrayal. Attorney Marcus Wright remained in touch as well, helping Emily navigate the slow grind of restitution and offering advice whenever new legal letters arrived. His steady professionalism reminded her that justice was not a one-time event, but a process. Private First Class Daniel Lee became her closest friend outside therapy. On weekends, they ran together along the Chattahoochee River, their boots pounding in rhythm the same way they had trained during basic. He cracked jokes about her stubborn pace, but he also listened when she shared memories of her father or confessions about her nightmares. With Daniel, she felt safe to laugh again, to remember she was 19 and not only a soldier, but also a young woman with a life to live. Evelyn Parker, the neighbor whose courage had saved her, called every Sunday evening. She filled the phone line with warmth, asking about Emily's week, sharing stories about her garden, and reminding her that someone was always in her corner. Sometimes, Evelyn drove down to Columbus for visits, carrying home baked bread wrapped in foil. Emily treasured those visits, letting the older woman's steady presence fill the space where her mother's had once been. These people became her squad, not assigned by the Army, but chosen by her own heart. With them, Emily began to heal. She also found purpose in sharing her story. Fort Benning hosted seminars on resilience and domestic violence awareness for new recruits, and Emily agreed to speak. Standing in front of rows of fresh faces, she told them about the night she crawled through the window, about the invoice that turned love into debt, about the courtroom where truth finally prevailed. She did not dramatize, she simply spoke with the raw steadiness of someone who had lived it. Many recruits wiped tears from their eyes. Some came up afterward to thank her for giving them courage to face their own struggles at home. Each time she spoke, Emily felt lighter, as though every word peeled another layer of Harold's shadow away. Meanwhile, Donna wrote letters, short, halting, filled with apologies. Emily read them but never replied. The words spoke of fear, regret, and love twisted by dependence. Emily cried sometimes while reading, torn between the ache of a daughter who missed her mother and the resolve of a soldier who could not let weakness back into her life. For now, forgiveness remained a bridge too far. Healing also meant reclaiming joy. Emily decorated her apartment with photographs of her father of her unit at graduation of sunsets over the Chattahoochee. She bought a dog, a rescue shepherd mix she named Valor, whose wagging tail and loyal eyes reminded her that love could be simple and unconditional. On early mornings, she ran with Valor, the rhythm of her footsteps carrying her into days filled with purpose. Slowly, the bruises on her spirit faded. She discovered laughter again, found pride in folding her uniform neatly each evening, and felt strength in cooking her own meals without anyone criticizing how much she ate. In moments of quiet, she sat on her balcony watching the horizon glow at dawn and whispered to her father's memory that she was making it one day at a time. Her chosen family often gathered in her apartment for simple dinners. Morales brought stories from her years in the service. Daniel brought music and jokes. Evelyn brought bread and warmth. And Marcus dropped by when his schedule allowed, always with legal updates, but also with genuine concern. Around that table, Emily felt the family she had once dreamed of. No invoices, no threats, no silence. Just respect, support, and laughter. Healing, she realized, was not about erasing scars, but about building a life where they no longer defined her. She could look in the mirror and see not just a survivor of Harold's cruelty, but a soldier, a daughter, a friend. She could believe in tomorrow without dread, and in those moments, Emily knew she was no longer alone. The morning air at Fort Benning carried the faint chill of early spring, a reminder that even in Georgia the seasons turned, that nothing remained stuck in winter forever. Emily Dawson laced her boots and stepped onto the training field, the sky just beginning to shift from pale gray to the first streaks of gold. Around her, soldiers gathered for the morning run, their voices carrying the cadence that had once seemed so impossible, but now felt like the heartbeat of her new life. Left, right, left, right. Emily's feet struck the ground in rhythm with theirs, her breath even, despite the miles stretching ahead. Each stride carried her further from the shadow of Harold Carter and closer to the promise she had made her father long ago. She remembered the nights in the hospital when she had wondered if she would ever feel steady again, when nightmares had painted her mother's silence and Harold's rage over and over. Now, with the sun breaking over the horizon and the cadence echoing in her chest, she felt the truth more deeply than ever. Harold had stolen money, had tried to steal her dignity, but he had failed to steal her honor. That belonged only to her, and it had survived. After the run, Emily paused at the edge of the field, watching her fellow soldiers gather their gear. She touched the small pearl earrings her mother had given her years before, the only gift that had ever felt genuine, and whispered quietly, "I kept going, Dad. I never bowed." It was not triumph alone that filled her, but peace. The quiet kind that comes when justice has been seen, when survival has turned into purpose. She carried that peace into every part of her life. At Columbus, she continued to speak at awareness programs, sharing her story, not with bitterness, but with conviction. Each time she told recruits about the invoice, the beatings, the crawl to the police station, she saw recognition in their eyes. She knew some of them came from homes where silence still smothered truth, and she hoped her story gave them courage to fight for themselves. She told them plainly that family could betray, that blood alone did not define loyalty. True family, she reminded them, was respect and love freely given. Donna's letters continued to arrive, and Emily kept them in a drawer unopened for weeks at a time. She was not ready to forgive, but she no longer let the words weigh her down. Healing meant accepting that her mother's journey was separate, that her silence had been her own prison, and Emily had no obligation to carry it. She chose instead to build her own family from the people who stood beside her willingly. Morales, Daniel, Marcus, Evelyn, and even Valor the shepherd mix, who bounded happily to greet her after every long shift at the base. These were the ones who proved that support did not come with invoices or conditions. These were her true family. News came months later that Harold had been convicted of fraud and assault, sentenced to years in prison. Emily did not attend the sentencing. She did not need to see him shackled to feel justice had been done. His downfall was not her celebration, but simply the closing of a chapter. She chose instead to spend that day running along the Chattahoochee River with Daniel, the sound of rushing water reminding her that life kept moving forward. She thought of her father's folded flag resting in its case, and of the legacy he had left behind: service, resilience, courage. She had carried those values through her darkest nights, and now they guided her future. Her dream of becoming a nurse in the Army began to crystallize a way of combining her father's spirit with her own path, caring for others, standing strong in crisis, turning pain into purpose. That was her resolution. On the anniversary of her father's death, Emily visited his grave at the cemetery in Augusta. She laid fresh flowers and placed the restored insurance documents beneath the flag for a moment before tucking them back into her folder. She told him about the trial, about Harold's mask finally breaking, about her mother's letters, about the friends who had become her new family. She ended with the words she had carried like armor. "I never bowed, Dad. I stood my ground. I hope you are proud." The breeze shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of spring, and Emily felt lighter walking back to her car. That night she wrote in her journal, the same one where she had documented bruises and receipts, only now she wrote about gratitude. Gratitude for Evelyn's voice that had urged her to run, gratitude for Morales's mentorship, gratitude for the Army that had given her the discipline to fight, gratitude even for her scars because they reminded her she had survived. And in that journal she wrote a final note to herself: family is chosen. Dignity is non-negotiable. Justice is worth the fight. She closed it with steady hands, no longer trembling. As Emily's story spread through military circles and local communities, she ended each telling with the same call to action: Have you ever been made to feel like a burden in your own family? Have you ever been told you owed something you never agreed to? Speak up. Find allies. Do not bow to bullies, because silence is their weapon, but truth is yours. She invited listeners to share their own experiences, to comment, to connect, because she knew the power of stories was not only in healing the teller, but in giving hope to those still trapped in their own storms. And so her resolution was not only personal but collective. She had faced Harold Carter and survived. She had stood in court and been heard. She had rebuilt her life with chosen family and found peace in service. But more than that, she had turned her pain into a beacon for others. The dawn at Fort Benning was no longer just the start of another day. For Emily Dawson, it was proof that no matter how dark the night, the sun always rose.